What is good, friends? Here we are back on Crux of the Matter, and today we are going to be discussing what is good, truly good. And today we are also filming on Veterans Day, so to all of you veterans listening, we sincerely thank you for your service. Again, as an Army ROTC cadet now, my gratitude just exceeds what I used to think of the military. So I appreciate everything that you guys have done for our freedom. As the Soldier's Creed says, I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life. So with that, we appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
For real.
And before we start this episode, we want to mention our new YouTube channel, hurrah, called Crux of the Matter Podcast. So go look it up, subscribe. This is our first fully live streamed video in its entirety, hopefully. So that'll be really cool. And we have a special announcement. Riley, you want to tell them what we got?
Yeah, so we're going to make our first appearance on a podcast. I think it'll be out next Monday night, but if that's too late for you, then it will definitely be out next Tuesday morning because we'll be recording sometime on Monday with our friends Luke and Ryan at the Bold Truth Podcast. So we'll probably include a link in the description for that, for where it is. I believe it's on Apple, Spotify. They do it through Anchor, so same as us. We don't know what we're going to talk about yet, so we'll see. I mean, having 4 people in one recording session is going to be nice. Hopefully it doesn't turn into a Catholic versus Protestant thing. But, I mean, I'm not saying that wouldn't be fun. But, we're
going to get a lot of new ideas here because that'll be our first technical interview podcast. And rather than just listening to us two rattle ideas back and forth, it'll be fun to get a new ball in the court.
Yeah, neither of us actually have to be the host. They can just pay us to be windbags. So that'll be fun.
And so just to clarify, that's the Bold Truth. B-U-L-L.
It's a play on words of like BS. So,
and with that, we shall return to the perennial question: what is good? And with that, if you read our title, it says we discovered the meaning to life.
5 easy steps.
Sounds like a self-help book, right? But no, it is ever simple. 2 parts. The meaning to life is to know God and let Him be known. Inspired by Frank Turek. And we understand that many of you are coming from different places, some Christian, some not, some anti. And with this episode, again, as Crux of the Matter, we here believe that we need to pursue the basic truths in the world. And with that, Christianity becomes an ever important part in that forever search for the truth. So it's about time in our 4th episode that we really sincerely think and contemplate and discuss and forever pursue the truth of the matter.
And we told you guys in the beginning, in the very first episode, when we devoted kind of a long segment, like at least 10 minutes, to just why we were doing the podcast in the first place. And today's episode is sort of about why we're doing the podcast. And so this is going to be a good one.
So get ready. Here we go. So starting off, we have this quote that everyone is attracted to parts of Christianity. Do you agree with this, Riley?
Yeah, and I agree with it, but there's a very smart man who most people have heard of from the Chronicles of Narnia named C.S. Lewis, but he's also a prolific Christian writer, and he wrote lots and lots of books, probably one of the best books on Christianity written in the 20th century called Mere Christianity, and so it was actually originally a set of BBC radio addresses to Britain while they were in World War II, and so it was sort of a beacon of light in a very dark time.
And if you know who this man is, it is C.S. Lewis.
Clive Staples. But, so from it was after he gave all these radio addresses, it was compiled into a book, and so in the second book of Mere Christianity, in the first chapter, he sort of lays out this big argument for Christianity, and he doesn't really start with saying that's his intention, but he says, if you're a Christian, you do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the world, the whole world, is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all these religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of the truth.
Ooh. So with that, do you believe that there are things which are good and things which are not? Because that desires a reference point, correct?
Yeah, and it's very common, particularly for people in the West who are largely ignorant of the rest of the world and of, their own history and world history. They'll see, foreign people engaging in some kind of tradition, and they'll say, why do they do that? Doesn't that seem a little bit silly? What is even the point of that? And it's because they reflect some sort of value statement about those cultures and something about the tradition. G.K. Chesterton has this analogy called the fence in the woods. It's called Chesterton's fence. And so if you come across a fence in the woods, you shouldn't tear it down simply for the sake of tearing it down. You should figure out why it was put there in the first place. He doesn't say never to tear down the fences, never to tear down some traditions, but you should figure out why it's there in the first place. And so, when talking about other cultures and these sorts of things, if you're, a Christian and a Western person, you're free to feel that they're weird, but you should, know a little bit of something about it before you critique it.
Yeah, and so even just in recent years, this has become a dominant topic: is why pledge to the American flag, the Pledge of Allegiance. And so with those things as tradition, we should question the origins and, of course, really reinforce why we do things. So
yeah, and there's, speaking of not critiquing things without knowing what they are, I'm sort of surrounded by this every day, and I'm not sure how much Landen will agree with this because this is pretty strong, but I wrote out a little rant about atheism because, when we're sort of going through this argument to get to Christianity, and this is from the same second book of Mere Christianity, I think it's like 5 chapters long, and C.S. Lewis pretty much just uses very basic Aristotelian logic and sort of separates things out in hierarchies. And so when talking about all the world religions and irreligions and anti-religions and a-religions, there's immediately the question of whether there is some kind of higher power or not. And the idea that there's not a higher power has always seemed ridiculous to me. And, all right, I'm just gonna have to say it. Atheism is the most wholly incoherent, evil, and logically bankrupt philosophy to ever show its hideous face on the earth. The trio of Marx, Darwin, and Freud wouldn't be possible without it. The legacies of eugenics, communism, and sexual degeneracy that have ravaged the West were only made possible by the emergence of a philosophy that is wholly drenched in nihilism, that asserts purpose does not exist beyond survival, reducing man in all his art, truths, beauty, discovery, and genius to a simple math equation where worth equals usefulness to survival. A fork has more value than the Mona Lisa from the atheist perspective. A childish philosophy that cannot answer the most basic question of where we came from and what our job is, and yet has the audacity to assert that it is the tribal religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, Judaism and Islam, and even Christianity are for children and not to be taken seriously. No, it's atheism that deserves no serious consideration and deserves nothing but contempt and to rot on the dustbin of history. If you really think that, atheism is the answer, you didn't pay attention to the 20th century. You missed the point. And so even some of the weirdest religions, some of the ones that we would judge the most, they have a point and a purpose to them. And, if you're just going to wholly avoid the answer to the meaning of life or answer it in a way that is, there is no purpose, I don't think your ideology deserves any serious consideration because you don't believe it yourself if you believe that. There are things that you care about that you really shouldn't if they're not related directly to survival. Why do you? We'll take the most little tiny example. Let's take sports. Why do you even care about sports anyway?
Yeah.
Why do you root for your favorite team all the time? And what is it about sports that draws your attention to it? Because it's a waste of your time. You could be procreating. You could be gathering food. You could be doing literally anything else other than watching sports. From a pure survivalist perspective, there's no point to it. In fact, if you play sports, you're putting yourself at danger of getting hurt and not being able to get a meal. So why do you do it?
And some would argue that people are drawn to heroes.
Yeah, and that's part of the human psyche. And so there are tons, that's just the most small, minute example, but there are tons of examples of that I could take just from everyday life that make no sense. They're totally incoherent, yet everyone does them. And, actually Lewis, in a different part of the same book, he points out that there's a moral law in the universe and that everyone believes it. And so even the people who don't believe it will still be outraged when someone steals something from them or takes their seat on the bus or promises something and doesn't give it, you already admit that you know about this weird contract that we all have, that none of us ever actually verbally agreed to, but we all know it's there, and none of us actually seem to not engage in it. Everyone knows that, if Landon were to take my phone right now and I were to say, give that back, and he didn't, I would be mad. I would be mad. He wouldn't do that. I would probably do it. It'd probably be the other way around.
Yeah, and so we look at these natural rights, the growing emphasis on human dignity, human rights, the just natural law. And the founders, of course, understood this. We've discussed previously that there is this natural law which binds us, and government is a social contract, acts as this sort of mediator between human rights and human dignity, not as the creators of them, but as the protectors and guardians. And with that, religion takes then the foundational underpin underneath them. So it is the linchpin under which our society as a whole stands.
Mm-hmm. Well, politics is downstream of culture, but what is culture downstream of? It's downstream of religion. Mm-hmm. And so, when C.S. Lewis is going through this whole argument back to Book 2 of Mere Christianity, after he eliminates atheism right off the bat, he kind of separates the higher power into like a power that picks sides, good and evil, or is amoral, existence itself, karma, or good and evil is actually the higher power itself. And so, that kind of brings us to the question of whether good and evil are objective concepts. So, Lennon had a verse saved, and I lost it, so that's my
Yeah, so as the Christian would argue, according to John 15:5, when Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing good. And with that, we see that apart from Christianity, there is no good intrinsic. And some would say, you show this act of kindness just out of the consideration of or sacrifice, and that is a good thing. And there's a feeling which might make that seem true. There's, of course, this element of like, okay, I kind of take that kindness to my heart. I take this pride in an accomplishment, like these things which seem good. And we must be careful to distinguish the feelings of goodness versus the natural goodness, which, as Christians would argue, only is found in Jesus and through our relationship with him. Mm-hmm. But going back to the question of, are you devoted to anything? I want you to think really deeply about this. And the question is if you answer that you are not devoted to anything, I ask you to be more self-aware.
Mm. First of all, from the biblical perspective, Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But I don't think anyone would actually contend that. Whatever you put the most value on is clearly where your heart is. So whatever you talk about the most, whatever you engage in the most, that's where your heart is. And so, as Christians, if we are talking about one thing all the time, it's probably some kind of signal that we're putting that thing on the throne of our heart. But if you immediately brush off the question, if you're, I'm not devoted to anything, you're not looking close enough, and I think you're being dishonest with yourself. So.
And then adding on to that, so if from the survivalist standpoint, where you need to work, there's a system where you grow up, and once you get to a certain age, you have to work. And so why is that so necessary to the history of humanity as the kind of products of our labor, the goods that progress humanity? And if that is important, it is because of the second point in Ephesians 4:28, when it says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Now, this directly ties into the second point of the meaning to life. So someone say, what's the meaning to life besides work? Like, this is just a drag on my life. There has to be more. And it is half of the thing. And it's only if you share in the first, which is to know God. Because what work is meant to be is the act of sharing God with others. It is that act of work, the charity, that some would say. And in that, we are given this gift that transcends anything that you have to give yourself. Because it's been given to you freely and with extreme, extreme pain on a cross.
Yeah, and I would also say, just to sort of summarize the point that we're making, like in the beginning we stole from Frank Turek, that the meaning of life is to know God and let him be known. And so Jesus sort of gives us, probably the most obvious place to look for it is the Great Commission at the end of Matthew, where he says, go out and spread my name to all the nations, and, behold, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. But there's sort of three basic parts to Christianity. You, the Christian, you were supposed to become more like God, and then, you're supposed to help other Christians become more like God, which is discipleship. And you're supposed to spread the word to people who don't know it yet. And that's evangelism. And so those are sort of the three most basic parts of Christianity. They would fit under the general definition of to know God and to let him be known. But if you're a Christian, those are the things you're supposed to do.
And it's hard to understand that also without understanding the precedents. And this is something that I think it's so often overlooked in evangelism, and in a modern culture we just accept premises or that people understand this. But it's important to know this two-word phrase, imago Dei. And with that, you, me, Riley, we are all made with the image of God. We were all made in the image of God. And while that was tainted along the way, the only reason for that reconciliation and the only thing why there's a meaning to life at all that shows incompleteness in everything else is because you are trying to return to that state of completion.
Mm-hmm. When you look at the whole narrative of the Bible, God created Adam and Eve to be in relationship with him. Christianity is always and everywhere about relationships. Mm-hmm. If it's not about relationships, if it becomes about systems or, about upholding the dominant order or anything like that, you're missing the point. It's always and everywhere about relationships. God walks with Adam in the garden, and then, Adam and Eve screw up, so they get thrown out of the garden, but God still speaks face to face with, Noah. And then he speaks through sort of and also to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he sort of speaks in a disembodied voice or in a cloud or a pillar of fire to Moses and the Israelites. And then you get to the prophets, and instead of speaking to the whole nation, he's only speaking to one person. And then,
the silence for hundreds of years.
Silence for hundreds of years. And then, as the Bible says, in these last days, he has spoke to us through his Son. And then after Jesus leaves, he says, I'm sending you the Helper, the Holy Spirit, which is also in the Old Testament, but that's a whole separate episode because that would be something very interesting. But it doesn't really matter the medium through which God is communicating. It matters that always and everywhere Christianity is about the relationship between God and people. We screwed up. There's a divide. God is going to fix it. That's the point. That's the whole story. That's all 66 books or however many are in the Bible. I feel like that might be off. But however many books are in the Bible. Yeah. That's about the whole narrative. And when he finally comes back with the new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem and reigns on his throne, we'll finally be in relationship with him. And people have this fundamental misunderstanding about Christianity, particularly people who have contempt for Christianity. They misunderstand the concepts of heaven and hell. The person who gets into heaven, God says, they say to God, thy will be done. You're submitting your own will to God's in the end when you get into heaven.
Obedience.
Yeah. Hell is the person to whom God says, thy will be done. You decided to go your own way. That's the worst sin is pride, is sort of seeing yourself in this godlike position.
You become a God to yourself.
You become your own God. And God has, sort of had this predetermined hierarchy, and it's fairly obvious given his nature and his omnipotence and his omnipresence and his all goodness and everything like that. But he's above us, and he's above the angels, and he's above everything else. And as the creator, he deserves the praise that comes forth to him. So if you're a Christian, you struggle with like worship or praising God or what the point of that even is, it doesn't necessarily have to be singing or something like that. Whatever you do it as if you were doing it for me. But however you have treated that is what you have done to me when Jesus is giving that whole story in the New Testament. But if you struggle with worship and praise, that's sort of the whole point,
The abiding factor.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what abiding means, it means to remain in. Mm-hmm. And so again, John mentions that I am the vine, you are the branches, as Jesus speaks. And, you can see that apart from me, you can do nothing good. Again, it's just this reinforcement of this true relationship. And again, back to the meaning of life. Some people say meaning of life is to have a relationship.
Yeah.
But they pursue that in a secular sense. And we're saying, well, there is an element of truth to that. Again, going back to the crux of the matter, you desire this connection because of our whole creation for this pure relationship with God.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us back to, now that we've eliminated the childish philosophy of atheism, we sort of get back to, okay, is there some disambiguated amoral power, or is there a God who picks sides? And it's pretty clear that if you're attempting to argue that there's an amoral power, but there's also good and evil, that sort of becomes incoherent because one of them is above the other, and then that seems really weird. Like, how could an amoral God be above the... Like, good and evil doesn't apply to me, but it applies to everyone else. Like, that's a little bit silly. But then you put it the other way around, and he's beneath good and evil. Like, and then he's amoral. It is amoral, and it chooses not to get involved in matters of good and evil. Then it also stands condemned. And so, once again, going back to Lewis, because he's extraordinarily brilliant, and you should read all of his books, all of them. But
that's a high command right there.
But he sort of gives this analogy of the amoral God, or pantheism, as they called it in Great Britain. That's sort of a British, American, English language divide, because it's not quite the same thing. But let's just give him the word for argument's sake. That pantheism is like the painting is God. The painting, like all the beauty in it, that is God. The whole universe is God. And so it's seeing things. There's this quote, like, if you must believe that God is separate from the world, and I completely read the wrong sentence. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if only you could see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian replies, don't talk damned nonsense. And so there are other religions, and it pretty much comes down to the big three, which is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, that, there is a God, and he does pick sides, and he's on the side of good, and he's all-powerful. And so, when you get discouraged about things in your life and you're a Christian, you sort of have the luxury of appealing to, well, things might not be going well now, and they might not ever go well within my earthly life, but God is on his throne. And so, at the end of the day, everything is going to end up the way he desires and for our ultimate good.
And this is a perfect time to mention how a lot of people have a hardening of their hearts towards Christianity because people in the past have abused it for their own sake, whether it be for wealth, for power, or for lust, the big three that tend to be kind of perpetual across time. And Abraham Lincoln kind of flips that saying on its head by saying, during the Civil War, when someone asks, is God on our side? And as Riley said, when you say God picks sides, is good and evil, of course you have to choose. But then Lincoln responds saying that the better question is, are we on God's side? And this is something that gets so often forgotten in history. And I think if you, as someone who struggles with that kind of jaded view of the history of Christianity, as people have been so abused, and you can say, how can there be a God that loves us when the people are so corrupt? And often that becomes the issue, is because they end up saying, is God on our side? That's all they ask themselves. And then they continue to do what they want to do, versus saying, are we on God's side? And really self-reflect the limitations of their own power and saying, we really need to surrender this.
Yeah, and so, when people do bad things in the name of the gospel, just remember, to steal another thing from Frank Turk, do you blame Mozart if someone plays Mozart poorly? I don't know anything about music. If I attempted to play any piece from Mozart, it would sound so bad. But then it would be like if Landen overheard me playing and, I was trying to figure out Mozart.
He's like, Mozart's terrible
garbage.
Composer.
So overrated. Eminem's better. But it would be ridiculous, and that'd be ridiculous on its face. And so it's also, to remember, as Christians, that when Jesus is talking about how he will judge all things, and these people come to him and they say, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons and do many mighty miracles in your name? And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. Who does he say that to? People who cast out demons. That's who he said it to. So just be aware
who by men would be regarded as very righteous.
Yeah, saintly.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if your heart is not in right position to God, if you're not totally, if you don't totally recognize that God is above you, and and if you don't take joy in your relationship with God, if those two things aren't true, then you're in trouble. And so there's another verse that gets used all the time, and believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and you will be saved. And so that makes it very simple. And so that's sort of the, Billy Graham type evangelism. Like all you need to do is,
if you want a very watered down a starting point. And we don't want you to just accept it for what it is and then not think about it again.
Yeah.
Really pursue what does that mean?
Yeah.
What can it mean for your life?
But there are two perversions. Well, I guess there are four possibilities from that statement. You actually believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. You are saved. You do neither, you're not saved. That's pretty obvious. But there are these two in between. There are people who believe in their heart and they don't want to talk to anyone. Deny me in front of man and I will deny you before God. Christianity is not a private religion. Get that through your head. There are a lot of people who don't understand this, that, particularly in the West. I don't think people in China have a problem with it, the underground church over there where they're being tested every day. Mm-hmm. But in a country where Christianity has been, taken as the norm for forever, and, don't talk about politics and religion at the dinner table and that kind of thing. That's silly. Don't talk about it all the time. Don't become obsessed with it. But also, be aware that if you never ever talk about, the things that really matter, maybe not politics so much. It matters to some degree, but
if you never talk more fundamental than that.
Yeah, right? but politics is sort of, it's a little tree branch on it's a little tree branch on the trunk of religion. And if you never ever talk about that, you're not doing your job as a Christian. If you believe in your heart, like, I just, I live out my faith. I try to be a good person. It doesn't matter. Like Paul, who has more right to brag than anyone in the history of ever about how righteous he is. He goes in one of his letters and just gives this laundry list of things that were just incredible. And he's always kept the commandments, and he's never cursed his elders and all these different things. And he says, "But I consider my righteous works as filthy rags in comparison to the gospel." Filthy rags. The most accomplished person, who probably, from man's standard, the most righteous, accomplished person who ever could have represented Christianity, and he says they're filthy rags. Yeah. Because he understands that apart from me, you can do nothing. And then so the other sort of perversion of the statement, confess with your mouth.
Yeah. The outward appearances, which the Pharisees are a prime example of that in the Bible, which if you don't know, they are the group which Jesus attacked the most. Mm-hmm. And to realize that those were the spiritual leaders of the time. So that is saying something. The
spiritual and political leaders. They were in charge of Jerusalem underneath the Roman jurisdiction. So it was their job basically to make sure that the Jewish people didn't get too uproarious against the Romans, but also to try and they were balancing this weird thing of pleasing the world and pleasing God, which is a whole other problem that you're really not supposed to go into. But, confessing with your mouth and not believing in your heart, that's, for one, false teachers. In the American church, you'll hear 10 times more sermons about, God's love and all this and blah, 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 which is good. God is love. God's also wrath.
But it's not the secular love.
Yeah.
It is this true love.
It's true. Yeah. Truer love has there's no truer love than this, that a man would, give up his life for his friends. And so, you have to, if you don't believe in your heart, then, and you're saying it with your mouth, then you're I don't know, you're doing Christian face. You're not blackface, but I don't know, Christian face. You're a false teacher. You're not.
It's a two-faced facade.
Yeah, and so the Pharisees, this one of my favorite parts in the whole of the Gospels. I don't really have a favorite part, but one of the better parts is the 7 woes to the Pharisees. And he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, straining out a gnat and swallowing the camel." And then he also talks about how they're making sure that you have the exact right amount of teaspoons of mint, dill, and cumin, and you rejected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and righteousness. And you'll only realize the correct hierarchy of things if your heart is also in the correct position. You believe in your heart and you confess with your mouth. Both of them. It's not like one, like
The
we
two
sort
are
of just view it.
inseparable.
Yeah, you sort of just view it as one statement, like, oh, okay, that's really, it's simple. It's not easy.
Yeah.
That's always the truth about Christianity. It's very simple. It's not easy.
Not easy.
And so,
Yeah.
sort of coming back to the three great monotheistic religions as they're referred to, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Judaism sort of comes first, and so Christianity is basically the correct ending of Judaism. And so Judaism as it exists, like if you still believe in the law and the prophets, but you rejected Jesus, then you missed the whole point. Like it's something that like is undyingly sad to me that, the like it's just such a weird dichotomy that the man God came to save, he was rejected by his own people. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones its wise men, how long I wish to gather you under my arms as a mother hen gathers her eggs.
Yeah, and so I think we'll move on to the more apologetic side. So say you have questions about the faith, or again, you are a Christian but wish to learn more. To really understand the crux of the Christian faith, again, returning to our theme here, really comes down to 1 Corinthians 15:17. So this, for some context, was a letter written by Paul to the church in Corinthia, and he says that, "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins."
That is a positive truth claim. There is one truth claim that is central to the entirety of Christianity. If you could disprove that, you disprove Christianity.
Yeah, on its face, like one verse, and just the entire thing goes up in smoke. And so why does it still exist then? If everyone would want to target it, all the atheists, everyone. But because there are truths in it, and as we'd claim, it is the truth.
So I have this. I've had this saved on my phone for a while, and I'll leave a link if anyone wants to email about it and they want some proof positive from it. Then I'll email a link to you. Just reach out to cruxofthematterpodcast@gmail.com, because this is pretty incredible. So this is information we know about Jesus and the baby Christians, the way as it was originally called, in the immediate aftermath of it happening. So the sources are Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian, the Jewish Talmud, the Roman historians Cornelius Tacitus, Gaius Suetonius, I don't know. That was close enough. The Roman philosopher Mara Serapion, and Roman governor Pliny the Younger. So these are all facts from outside the Bible. Some of them neutral, like Rome. Some of them objectively against what the Bible has to say, like the Talmud. The Talmud says that Jesus was, the devil, basically.
The devil.
Yeah, and so here's the list of facts. All of them attest to a historical man named Jesus who was most definitely crucified under a Pontius Pilate. Here are the facts we know for sure, just from the extra-biblical sources. Jesus had a brother called James, was located in Palestine, the Roman district, was known to be a wise, virtuous, and ethical man who was reported to have both performed miracles and made prophecies that were fulfilled. He had many disciples, Jews and Gentiles, encountered a man called John the Baptist who baptized him, was worshipped as a deity, and some believed he was the Jewish Messiah and called him king. Some saw Jesus as a philosopher with unique teachings. Jewish leaders judged him guilty of apostasy. No one came forward to support Jesus during his trial. He died at the hands of Pontius Pilate, who crucified him, which occurred on Passover Eve. He was nailed to a cross. After his death, executioners gambled over his clothing. There was a 3-hour darkness at the moment of crucifixion and an earthquake, and his teaching spread after his death. The Christian religion was named after him. Christians formed their own section of society. They exercised faith in his teachings. They believed in their own eternal immorality, and they openly scorned death. They believed Jesus' death procured their salvation. That is all from outside the Bible. There.
Yeah.
All of it.
So if you claim, Christians only will support their faith through their own religious text, then really look closer, especially Josephus. I mean, he is one that once more people hear about, you really start questioning that whole sola scriptura, or that we can only stand our own laurels type argument, because there are so many other historical, archaeological now, evermore. If you've ever heard the Tel Dan inscription, it was discovered because until then, people didn't even think if King David was a real person. And then they found this inscription by another king who said, oh, look, I just won a war against a king from the house of David. Just all those arguments up in smoke. And now, of course, archaeologists who are largely atheist or just anti-Christian will now argue, well, how large was King David's kingdom? Because the Bible says it was huge, but we're probably going to say it's small.
Yeah, well,
It's
they're constantly shifting the window, and what they want is proof. But, since the Bible keeps getting proven over and over again by archaeology, maybe you should just take a back seat and try to prove your own religion instead of trying to disprove another. But, as C.S. Lewis says, if you don't understand books written for adults, then don't talk about them. So, sort of coming back to...
While still understanding your right to the freedom of speech.
Yeah. So, there's Vadi Bakum, very somewhat famous preacher. He should be more famous than he is because he's a really solid biblical teacher. This is basically how he describes why he believes the Bible. I choose to believe the Bible because it is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies, and they claim their writings to be divine rather than human in origin. That's the claim that Christianity is making. And so it's kind of funny that it's still here after 2,100 years almost. And it's still not been disproven. So, just disprove the resurrection. Should be pretty...
That's all I have to do.
Should be pretty easy to prove that a dead guy didn't rise from the dead, but somehow it's still here. So.
And to posit another very, very genuine question. If Christianity were true, would you believe it? Because again, is truthfulness a virtue in your eyes? Or is this life of what you want to do, making yourself your own God, something that you want to do, or even say sacrificing yourself to help others in life, but not believing that there is a higher order, does that really recognize truthfulness as the highest virtue for you? That's something I want to consider.
If you hesitate to answer that question or outright, answer it with no, then you're not being intellectually honest with yourself. You're lying to yourself, and so it's like, if Christianity were true, would you believe it? And so, it is true. That's why I believe it. And so, going back to a completely different C.S. Lewis book called The Screwtape Letters, also highly recommended. It's a little tougher to read than Mere Christianity, which is sort of a beginning level book. There's this conversation going on. And so basically the premise of the book, if you haven't heard of it before, is there's this young demon in training, and his uncle, Screwtape, is the one writing these letters to him because his nephew, who I think his name is Wormwood, his subject, the person Wormwood is supposed to be basically assigned to, becomes a Christian. And so the very beginning, right after Wormwood's subject becomes a Christian, Screwtape, the veteran demon, tells him, make him believe that he believes Christianity because it's smart, or because it's intelligent, or because it will help Britain win the war, or because it's compassionate, and never, ever, 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 under any circumstances, let him believe it solely because it is true.
Let that sink in for a second.
So, Christians always and everywhere have made rather bold truth claims, and it's not because we're hyperbolic, it's because we actually believe what we say. I believe Christianity because it's true. Period. End of story. Not because it helps when we have these little, political arguments, not because it makes me cool, which it definitely doesn't. Not because it wins me any sort of intellectual superiority over anyone. I believe it because it's true. Period. Bar none. End of story. Take it to the bank. So
yeah, some will say, "Oh, I believe this because it works for me." Again, that's such a fallacy in itself.
That's totally silly. Believe it because it works for you. That's not why you believe anything. You believe it because it's true. You might believe in your lawnmower since it works for you. But it's also true that the lawnmower is there. Otherwise, it would be silly to say. If you were sitting around with scissors saying it's a lawnmower, and well, it works. Well, that's no. You believe things because they're true. That's why you believe things. Sometimes we can get caught up in believing things because they're beneficial, or because they're good, or because they're necessary for our survival. But ultimate things that are the world of ideas, as Plato would say, things that help you step out of his cave. Those those ideas are always and everywhere concerned about what is true. If you're the type of person to say that you don't believe in objective truth, then I don't think you actually believe that yourself.
Is that an objective claim then?
Yeah.
That you don't believe in objective truth?
There is some kind of objective truth. We all know it. I mean, we already talked about it earlier. Just like, if someone if you get up on like a city bus and someone takes your spot, give me my spot back. Why would you expect him to do? Like if you were, someone who believes in subjective truth, then like how could you say that? Or subjective morality, like how could you say that? Subjective truth and subjective morality and objective truth and objective morality, they kind of go together because, true things are most often good things. Like I said when we were explaining the purpose of this podcast in the first episode, I think I said something like, we're concerned with what's true and what's good and what's beautiful. But there's a reason I said what's true first instead of what's beautiful. So, be precise with your words.
Oh, you gotta have Jordan Peterson make an appearance sooner or later, right?
I don't really want to do any other ones because that's my only decent one. So,
yeah. But I really want to, reinforce that question. Of course, we all still have questions. There's an element of faith to it, and I think that often is the only excuse to saying, "Oh, well, I have faith. It's true." Mm-hmm. But no, really look at the details, because if you acknowledge faith as like the only thing you have to stand on, then going to places like college where they'll confront you with opposite ideas and questions of theology that it making you question your faith even more. Or we see this huge trend, is it upwards of 80%, I think, of so-called Christian college students prior to college then fall away from the faith.
Evangelicals.
Yeah. It's pretty high.
Well, and also there's sort of this amazing con that I think probably the enemy, probably the devil, has pulled, and he pulled it on the church in the 80s and 90s and sort of 2000s, that faith is just, believing in God. No, it's believing God. You might say, that's why make that distinction? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. It's not a question of whether there is a God. It's that God tells you to do something, and you do it. That's what faith is. It's not, I believe in God. That's your testimony. That's your statement of faith. And so those two things are completely different. Completely different. Your central claim, what you believe, is not the same thing as faith, which is the courage to follow through on what God tells you to do.
Yeah, so true. Can't seem to find the statistic about the falling away from Christianity for college students after and before.
It's pretty high. I know that Christianity as a whole has been declining in the West, and so there's this other thing that we'll probably have an entire episode about pretty shortly. The only original idea I've ever come up with, it's the only phrase I've ever coined. But there's a large contingent of people who aren't atheists, meaning they make an assertive claim that there is no God. I don't care how many times atheists say, "No, I just don't believe in your God." Well, no, you don't believe in all of them. So, it's a positive statement of faith that there is no God when an atheist, what makes you an atheist. There are agnostics who decline to, they basically say there's no way we can know, but apathetics don't care about questions of meaning and belief in existence. And that, like, the number of people who just don't care about anything, they're not even engaging in like sins of making politics an idol or something. They're straight up. They don't care about anything, and there's a very deep-seated nihilism, particularly with our generation. So those people, I call them the apathetics, and so we'll have a whole thing about that. But pretty much the only thing that's going to be able to answer that question in the future is Christianity. No other ideology is equipped to answer the question, and Christianity is true, and I think people have lost, the appeal of true things is that they're also good, and so ultimately true things. It's true that this computer is on a desk right now. Like that's a fact. That's not true. Right. And we're talking about what's true.
And the world will continually peg those against each other. They'll say, well, your Christianity is inherently oppressive. Mm-hmm. It's anti-this. It's phobic of this. It's anti-this. Mm-hmm. And really question then what is good. Because you have to have your reference point too then. Mm-hmm. And if it is purely just to let people be people, then really understand, well, again, is there a meaning to life?
Yeah, and Christians should be aware that you are, in every age, like we forget it when we have sort of these peaceful ages and these good ages where there's a lot of freedom and there's plenty of Christianity to go around. But you should always remember that there's this thing called the spirit of the age, which we're constantly fighting against until it's over. I mean, not until your life is over, but until God decides to end the timeline and bring back the new Jerusalem and the new earth, the new heaven. We're going to be fighting against the spirit of the age. And so in eras where Christianity is the minority, it's pretty obvious what the spirit of the age is. It usually shows itself pretty quickly and fairly obviously what the spirit of the age is. But in eras where Christianity is prosperous and there are free times and we feel like we've done everything. We're like the NBA or NFL player at the end of their career. Like, I've done everything. I've made 10 All-Stars, blah, blah, blah. I won my championship. I'm done. I'm going stat chasing now.
And then they become complacent.
Yeah, and then they become complacent, and that's how they get replaced. And so, sports is a very silly, lowbrow example to use. But, that's the spirit of the age when Christianity is in charge. When Christianity succeeds in some degree, then the spirit of the age has to become subversive and often will try to infiltrate the church. There were, when Jesus is telling us about the end times, he says that many people will say, "Look, there he is over there. Look, there he is. He's over here. Come look. He's over there." And he says, don't follow them, don't believe them. There will be many false teachers in the last days. You will know when the Son of Man's coming back. He'll split the sky. Like it'll be like lightning going across the sky. That's what it says.
You're not gonna stay asleep.
Yeah,
Let's
like
put it that way.
Yeah, when I see it, I'm not gonna text Landon, "Oh my gosh, are you seeing this?" I'll just be like, "Oh, I'll see him in the New Jerusalem in 5 minutes." That's what I'll think. If it comes around in our lifetime, which there's a good chance it
prophecies. Yeah. But is there anything else you'd like to add, Riley, before we start wrapping it up?
Well, I mean, just kind of as a final appeal to everybody who's listening, I know that we came out with some pretty strong statements on this one, probably stronger than statements we've made. I know, in previous episodes, I've couched my words a lot, and that's because I don't feel like an expert. I don't feel like an expert on philosophy or politics or history, but I am an expert in this. So, please come at me, hate mail, which we probably won't get. But actually, seriously though, please send us genuine questions. But if like today troubled you for some reason, then give Christianity a shot. There are lots of bad sources, but probably the best place to go and look at Christianity, read the actual Bible. And if you're a Christian, you should do? You should read your Bible. Yeah. That would be a good idea. And some of these verses we had typed up, but a lot of the verses me and Landon were saying were just off the top of our head. Because this sort of didn't follow the original track we had planned for the podcast. But, know your Bible. Know the values that are in it. People who believe it in their heart but don't speak it out, they'll, usually there's a positive correlation between those kinds of people and also not knowing their Bible very well. You should know your Bible very well. It should be, and you always have time, 3 minutes. Don't read bare minimum one verse, and then on nights when you have time, read a chapter.
Set realistic goals, I think is what you're trying to get across, right?
Just do the bare minimum at first, and you'll start to find yourself enjoying it more. And so, my dad has been reading, he converted when he was he's going to roast me if I'm wrong, but 17 or something like that. And so, he's been reading his Bible for, almost 30 years. Not quite 30. Math. Not quite 30. I'm really bad at math.
No, he's young. He's young. It's okay.
Yeah, but for 20, he's been reading his Bible for 25 years, and you can come back to the same little chapter or excerpt 100 different times, and some new meaning will pop forth that you hadn't seen before, and
because it's a living document.
Yeah, in the real sense of the word, not the silly legal sense of the word. But just remember. All Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, correcting, training, and something else in righteousness. I forgot one. Discipling. Yeah. Yep. Discipling and training in righteousness. So, all of it's useful, including Song of Solomon. Don't dwell on that for too long. But all of it's useful, so you should read it. And so, if you're someone who is not a Christian, then, I mean, it's helpful for you to read it, but you should also remember, like we were saying, and like God says, Christianity is about relationships and about, repairing the relationship between you and God. So for me, like, I've been an adult for like a year, basically. But I've been a Christian for quite a while. Probably, since I was like 13 or 14 years old is when it stopped being my parents' faith, something that I saw evidence of every day and we talked about all the time, and it started being mine. And so, if you're a Christian, you have your own personal relationship with God. You have a relationship with your pastor and the Christians who are older than you, who are discipling you, but always remember, you don't have to take their word for it. You got the big man's ear whenever you want, all the time. So, prayer and reading your Bible. It's funny that we're talking about these giant transcendent truths and what the meaning of life is, and somehow it comes back to pray and read your Bible. So, that's, so just kind of wrap it up today. Just a quick reminder, we have a YouTube channel up and running now. So I think it's Crux of the Matter podcast. And so the new logo has our faces on it. So the left side of our new logo is really nice. But the old logo, the old logo is the one that we're using for YouTube. And so it'll be the little sort of M with a T in it, which cross? Yeah, I guess we can sort of acknowledge now that Crux is also a little play on cross. So I don't know if any of you noticed that yet. But
symbolism is everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere. Symbolism is everywhere, and it's like there are hierarchies with lobster. No, I'm just gonna. But yeah, so we have a new YouTube channel. We'll give you a link to that. Please, we'll also give a link for the Bold Truth podcast. Our buddies Ryan and Luke, they're both Catholics, and so it'll be a really fun one. And they'll kind of, I don't know, I feel like I'll be a little more off the cuff. This one required a little bit more seriousness. Because it's something that I care about a lot, but that one should be a fun podcast, and all four of us yelling over each other. So I think that's pretty much it. Also, don't forget Crux of the Matter podcast at gmail.com. Please send us suggestions if there's an idea that you want us to visit or sort of look over. I mean, there are plenty of things we have never heard of before that we'd be more than happy to research and have a podcast about. If there are specific people who you'd like to see as a guest or something like that, don't request someone with 1 billion followers, but we'll probably start having guests on pretty soon. But please be subscribed to the YouTube channel, because we're going to try to get some live streams going.
And it helps us reach others who I think also are struggling to find out the meaning to life. So just something like this.
Yeah, this is the best podcast so far by 1,000,000 miles. So please share this one with people who haven't heard of it. A couple of you have told me that you're sharing it with tons of people so that's very cool. Shout out to Garrett. But so yeah, I mean that's pretty much it. That's it for today's episode. So I'm Riley Stansberry.
And I'm Landen Connor. Well, we'll see you guys next time on The Crux of the Matter.